Okay, here we are. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm quite excited to share this like late campaign special event with everyone, where we get to kind of take a moment and dive into some of the readings that we have shared in our background material section of the campaign page. So first and foremost, thank you for being here. Thank you for following Molly House, and also giving a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Cat, today. Uh, so, Dr. Cat, how are you doing, first and foremost?
I'm doing great, thank you.
And Cole, thanks for cutting on some time. I saw the leader stream just a few minutes ago, and it was great to get you there too.
Yep, I just ran right upstairs and into the 18th century.
As you do when you're doing, works of thinking about historical games, you have to really dive in. So today, since we're kind of structuring this around a bit of a book club, we've shared our some of the readings that we're going to be talking about today, and I think it's best if we keep this closer to that of a dialogue and a conversation, where we are lucky enough to have chat, but also if you're catching this after the video is done, we have the wonderful comment section. And I love our backers and our followers so much because usually they're very patient, very considered comments. And I like extending the conversation across whatever venue might happen. So if you're here live, thank you. Please feel free to join the conversation and we'll get there. But one of the most incredible things about Molly House is that it's it's an underrepresented history in terms of a lot of different media landscapes. And that it's I'm glad that we get to share this moment in our own gaming space, but also kind of help folks have access to this history that are even struggling finding readings about this too. So we're having to amplify in all different volumes this period. And I'll drop in chat actually for folks that cannot find it. I'll move over a link to the background readings shortly.
And while you're doing that, Drew, I'll say just a little word. We always think about our games as being like one part of a larger investigation, they're almost like pieces of pedagogy where we're trying to learn more about a period. And I always think about our games as fundamentally like historical novels. And in the same way that a historical novel can kind of immerse you in a setting and give you certain kinds of knowledge about a setting, it also can't teach you everything. And so we always think about our games as being really just one part of a larger process. And so usually, at the back of our rule books, we'll have these essays which are really just annotated bibliographies, where we kind of try to walk people through some suggested books and readings, and also put those readings in the context of their own creation. I think that second part's really important. So, for instance, on our game about Afghanistan, not only do we talk about learning about the Great Game, we also talked about the kind of problematic terminology of the Great Game and the fact that so much of how we understand 19th century imperialism is kind of caught through the prism of the Cold War, and in the way that the Cold War then kind of backwards informs all of these things that were in some ways appropriate, in other ways inappropriate. And really what we're hoping to do here is talk about is to kind of bring this conversation earlier into the process. I mean, usually those essays are at the back of a rule book, often after you've played the game or learned it, and the game has been published, several months in the future. That's when people start doing the other reading. We kind of want that process to maybe start a little earlier. So you don't have to wait for the back of the rule book. You don't need to wait for the published game. We are here now with some starting readings to get us all situated in the world. And in one sort of general point that I'll make is that in a lot of ways, I think when people have talked about Molly House and been thinking about it, they find a lot of resonances for our own time, and that's certainly true. But when you get into the historical weeds, you also find there are a lot of things that are very specific to its time that are also kind of worth underlining and mentioning.
I think this is probably a good moment to also back this over to you, Kat. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your channel, and about your training and interests in various different parts of history?
Yes, so I have a PhD in early modern literature and culture. So I think Cole and I almost bookend this period because you're a Victorianist, I'm an early modernist, and the stuff we're talking about sits in the middle. So my stuff stretches to where this begins, and your stuff probably harkens back to it. So
Yes,
we kind
exactly.
of meet. This is where we meet in the middle, and it affects both of our periods in various ways. In my doctoral studies, I was looking at how the words trash and trifle got used over a 100-year period, which is incredibly niche, but that is the way of the PhD. And one of the things that showed me was that far too often when we encounter and engage with history, we are looking at the aspiration of people. What are they trying to achieve? And I think we also do that when we approach people's motivations in everyday life. And what my studies taught me is the importance of looking at what people are looking to avoid, where the focus of their abjection is. Because half of the story is aspiration, and the other half of the story is rejection and fear. And so that's kind of where that study began. I'm very interested by, in quotes, hidden histories, things that don't tend to make it into your mainstream books. If I have a problem finding a biography of a certain figure or a series of articles about a particular time, for example, the Mollies, I want to delve deeper and deeper. The fact that I was mentioning, I said to Drew that I was trying to get hold of a copy of Mother Clap's Molly House, not the play, the book that it's based upon. And I was on a waiting list at the British Library for years, never saw it. And I also tried to buy it online, put my money in, can't get hold of a copy. The fact that this book exists, but I can't get access to it, drives me a little bit wild. And it's just one of the reasons, it's one of the things that makes me go, tell me more about all of this stuff. So that's what I do. I have a YouTube channel where I talk about various things from history. And in the rest of the time, I go into heritage settings. Occasionally, I dress up in period dress and I try and tell the stories from history. And hopefully, some of them are less well known ones.
Well, I certainly hope that folks might find themselves transported by this game and doing their own work of historical recreation, and even if it that whatever you're coming to the table, to having the next steps of of your journey of exploring that history or really education, having that access to primary and secondary texts. So it's very like core to like the kind of the whole project that is our game company, right? Goal.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Which is to say, maybe we'll jump right in. How's that sound?
Yeah, and I'll actually, well, I'm going to say one note about source availability.
Oh yeah,
which
yeah.
Kat mentioned, because there were books on John Company, which I badly wanted to recommend to people, but which were hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And if you live near an academic library, you might be able to find a copy of it. And so we always try when we're putting our sources together to have a mix of secondary work and primary work that we think is fairly affordable and easy to get access to. Interlibrary loans are a wonderful thing, but boy, that system breaks once you have more than 4 people looking for the same book, as I'm sure any book you've mentioned, Kat, on your channel has had that problem. So, one, and I'll just kind of say broadly, Richter Norton's Mother Clap's Molly House, which is a very interesting book, is a little hard to find even now. You can find copies, but they are very expensive, and not every library has it. And one thing I'll mention to it is, it is, and I think this is something that I'm trying to voice for Joe, because I think Joe is always very good about mentioning this. It is slightly dated in its approach, and there are a lot of really good work remains to be done on this subject, and a lot of the sources that we will be talking about today and that we will be putting into the game are period sources that anyone has access to, because thanks to the old daily records and some other sources as well. So sourcing is especially tricky for this particular game for reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about more.
Okay. I think that's a nice spot to underline also the things that are well available, which is to say the astounding amount of records that are preserved and available on old oldbaileyonline.org is astounding. And that's where we're gonna start. So we have some of the some of the proceedings that a few, and there are a lot more, but as suggested by Joe, these would be a great place for us to start with the sentence of Gabriel Lawrence. So who was Gabriel Lawrence? Do you want to Kat, do you want to take a stab at this particular character?
Well, he's a man who engages in sexual relationships with other men at Mother Clap's Molly House and elsewhere, who finds himself ensnared by the net of a moralizing force who have surrounded him with a bunch of informants, some of whom are presumably informing to save their own necks, and others who are, I believe, paid informants. And essentially, he is brought down because of the way he lives his life, and the moralizing Society for the Reformation of Manners don't like that.
Yes, right. And the not just liking the aspect of this person's entirety, but coming down to specific moments of having the testimonials of folks coming out and saying, I can validate that I saw this person a couple nights, and they did say he went off to get married. Feel like it's the structure is very different from how I think of from how law is working in today's context as well, which is another important I feel like important note that this is not that the society as a citizens group doing the enforcement work and bringing this trial works very differently than we might have a modern framework for.
True, but of course that's because we are a while before the advent of policing, and so or policing as we know it, and so it is very much a kind of community effort, and has been from before the Norman Conquest. So that kind of that you are responsible for the people around you, and you're kind of grouped together as this sort of circle of responsibility is something that's got a long history. One thing I want to flag up is I think with all of the people we're going to see today, and particularly those who find their way into these Old Bailey records, none of them have a title. None of them come from the blue-blooded aristocracy, because trust and believe, they are doing the exact same things, sometimes with the exact same people, but this is who is reachable.
I mean, this is a milkman, right? I mean, this is as average as I could think of an occupation.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, he's reachable in ways that people who are frequenting the court and encircling around the new Hanoverian dynasty simply are not.
Well, in this, I mean, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but it contrasts so markedly with Officer Rigby, who we'll talk about later, who is caught but does not suffer the usual fate. And it's hinted at least that this is some combination of friends and influence and sort of things pulling the string. I want to underline something you said about the nature of policing. So you mentioned, Kat, that you and I are sort of in the like we collectively stretch across the kind of similar period, interested in similar kinds of questions, but viewing them almost from reverse vantage points. When I was talking about this game very early on, maybe a year or two ago, I made a comment that said it was so interesting that this was essentially before policing. Because for me, I think about the novel and the police, and I think about Mr. Bucket in the mid-19th century, and policing and the surveillance state being very closely linked to the growth of government authority within the metropolis. But of course, policing did still happen in the early 18th century, but it was primarily citizen led. So it's worth thinking. It's worth realizing that an officer. It wasn't as if the police captured Gabriel Lawrence, right? This is a person being captured by fellow citizens and kind of brought in. Like policing what was seen as the aegis of the community, which that has its its own peculiar tyrannies associated with it. And so I just wanted to underline that, I think when we talk about policing, it's really important to recognize we're really talking about something very different than the contemporary police state.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, I think one of the things that marks that marks Gabriel Lawrence's trial compared to other notes is the amount of time and community involvement. It feels like there's a community that's coming around the validation of this particular person's life experience. Is that it's not a one-off moment that was caught and is and accused of buggery or something. Is that this is someone's full identity that we're talking about too, right? This wasn't an instance. I think it was an important moment.
Well, and it's amazing how intimate the accusation is, right? I mean, we are looking at. I mean, these Old Bailey records can be a little bit difficult to parse, but because it's sort of like you're listening to several voices at the same time when you're reading one. But a lot of this is in first person from essentially the accuser, right? And so it's Drew, to your point about this being a full picture of a person, it's the depth of the accusation, right? So this is something that I had been there several times and seen 20 or 30 of them together making love. I mean, these are long, intimate accusations coming from not from hearsay, but from folks who are kind of directly on the ground, and we're kind of closely affiliated with the accused.
Mm-hmm. And moving forward to our next person, William Griffin, accused of committing sodomy with the same person, which we'll find out later about Thomas Newton. So so I guess this would be another moment where again this particular findings, this particular trial is as well as the previous one, ended up found guilty and also leading to death, right? So these are some of the exceptional and large cases of the Mollies that paid this ultimate price for living as they did. But also this is William Griffin as blackmailed or as caught by Thomas Newton as others.
It's certainly it's a shorter deposition. We hear about a sort of singular act going on, and I think at some point we're going to talk about what Mother Clap's Molly House actually was as a site, a space, because we're hearing about these things and they're being tied to this location, and as we unpack more, I'm sure we'll talk about who the different people frequenting it are. But yeah, William does seem, he's certainly got less said about him than Gabriel, doesn't he?
Yeah, but this actually might be a nice point to then talk about who Mother Clap was, because both of these are at Margaret Clap's house. And I think it's an important key figure. I mean, even on the Molly House board, this is the central place, is that we wanted to talk about Mother Clap's. Not to say that Mother Clap's is exceptional, but a lot is written and shared about this space.
I think the thing that why Margaret Clap is the focus of attention in the way she is because within the community of Mollies, she should be an outsider, because what we have here is a cis woman who has been married, who runs a business, who provides this space for these people, seemingly because she wants to. And so I think she sparks the imagination, because what she is doing, presumably for some profit, is risky in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be. If she's got these rooms with all of these beds in it, she could run a knocking shop.
Hmm.
She doesn't have to be running a molly house.
Mm-hmm.
She could be a madam,
Yeah.
which would have penalties, let's be clear, but it wouldn't have quite the same level of danger for the people that come through her doors as we see the molly house does.
And especially to the length of that, to the length and to the extent of that community building. I mean, 2 years to lodge William in that space is not to say that this is a sudden change of character or a moment. Is that to say that there's something exceptional about this, about Mother Clap, that wanted to that fostered this space.
Yeah.
And this is in the broader context of molly houses like this are existing. There are references in these depositions to a few others, just kind of elliptically, but this was undoubtedly one of the larger and central ones, right? And so I do think it's important to note. I think it's always important to put things in the kind of historical opportunity cost, right? Because there were other things that Margaret Clap could have been doing, but this was something that she was directing her attention to. I mean, I think this is probably a good time for us to move into her deposition, which I think is so fascinating, and is also a great example of how these depositions can sometimes reveal more than they mean to, right? So, these are depositions that are getting published publicly, and certainly published later publicly, but also even at the time. And in preserving proof of offense, we also find a little bit, like a fly in amber or something, like these little pieces of a culture that are just kind of like suspended inside the deposition. And so something originally meant, as a satire, as we'll talk later, or as an example of some kind of horrendous behavior, actually are an amazing like fragment of a culture that is otherwise completely lost. And so so Samuel Stevens here in this in this deposition discusses going to the house in Holborn, finding 50 men there, making love to another, as they called it. Now, I just want to pause at that sentence, and I'm trying to avoid, I think, Kat, I wonder if this happens to you. I'm often over applying my close reading practices to historical documents, which is never a bad thing, never a totally sound historical way of reading. But I just want to pause on this one. I found near 50 men there making love to one another, as they called it, which is just this amazing moment where we're getting this phrase, making love to one another, as a explicitly queer phrase. It's getting kind of like highlighted and sort of put up as an example. And that again, that highlighting allows that phrase to survive, to this moment. And then, of course, it continues to talk about, and we can talk about these in specifics, but specific motion, the dances, curtsies, language of women, and then examples. Oh, sir, pray, sir, dear sir, right? These are these little fragments, these little elements of a whole subculture, of a whole, subsumed language that we can kind of see in practice.
And I think there's something in that, and in the concern around within these depositions, what this individual, what Samuel Stevens thinks is worthy of comment, is that he thinks it's worthy of comment that they aren't simply doing the act of sodomy as it was known, that if anything, he's almost saying it compounds it, that they're calling it making love, that they are cross-dressed, that they are aping the behaviors of women, that they are allowing themselves to be effeminized. And there is a large culture dating back before this of rather vehement attacks on certain things, the playhouses being one, foreign fashions, all sorts of things, where it talks about their capacity to make men into women. There are a series. There's a pair of pamphlets called Haik Veer and Hic Mulia, which is the mannish woman and the womanish man, and these kinds of concerns about the failure to conform to one's gender as accepted by society. They think sex is mutable, but particularly in a humoral context, but breaking through those boundaries of gender is very, very concerning because it's tied into things like sumptuary law and the great chain of being, where by God's design, men are placed above women, women are chattel. And for a man to ape a woman is a subversion of that great chain of being, of that divine order, of sumptuary law. It is the pauper being the king.
I feel like this is like also another moment of like why this historic moment is also the third like project that we're pursuing, right? In the way that it's sitting inside of empire, it's sitting inside of the like a cultural hand like reaching into across a lot of different places and a lot of different kinds of people. It might be a more intimate story than talking about how power works in across families inside the East India Company. But there is this like similarity of like the wielding of power that is happening at this like localized scale that I think was really compelling, thinking of this game, you know, coming and living with our company too, right? Which is to say, this historical like period is resounds on those similar notes.
Well, and I I want to touch on a comment that that someone left in the chat, which someone asked, were these molly houses opulent places, or were they broadly accessible? And I think this is actually a question that we can't answer, and then it relates to something that Drew and Kat were both talking about, which is, you know, the the people who are attending, who are being, you know, put to pillory, are ordinary people. These are milkmen. These are folks kind of coming from a variety of different strata, but not, you know, as Kat put it earlier, you know, we don't see a lot of titles in the people being brought before the Old Bailey. Um, uh, but that gives us a different kind of grounding here, because these are folks who are getting caught up in um, the growth of policing, and specifically its moral component, and who don't have protections of class and privilege that are going to shield them from it, right?
But of course, it doesn't matter. It doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't nobles in Mother Clap's Molly House. They just weren't scooped, or if they were,
Yes.
they were allowed to leave.
Right.
One
Yeah.
thing that fascinates me about the Georgian period, particularly as it goes on, is there is this real sort of bleed in social classes. So you have got people who were enslaved rubbing shoulders with politicians and making music. You have got them, a formerly enslaved man who trains as a boxer ends up at the coronation of George IV. So we have this, and there's a whole host of bare knuckle boxers at George IV's coronation in full bib and tucker. There is this kind of unusual bleed, and people will go and they'll go to the amphitheatre to watch a bare knuckle boxing bout. There is no doubt in my mind that they will go and gamble, and they will almost certainly, if the mood takes them, either go to the molly houses to partake in its delights or to observe it, to do a tourism. I'm sure, Cole, that there's that kind of, in the Victorian period, there is poverty tourism.
Yes.
that in many ways is fostered and furthered by the writings of Dickens becoming so popular, that this becomes for some people, this is going to become a human zoo.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can keep your lip zipped, you're welcome.
Right.
Potentially.
Well, I mean, this brings me to a really, I guess, kind of remarkable element of this whole of this whole deposition and I'm specifically speaking about Mother Clap's deposition, which is you have or Samuel Stevens's deposition within the proceeding for Mother Clap, this real worry about speech and language and presentation, and specifically its unrepentant character. They talked of all manner of the most vile obscenity in her presence, and she appeared wonderfully pleased with it. Right. And I mean, and that's the final sentence, right? That's the knock of the bell. And it is the particularly public or quasi-public nature of it. And it sort of brings to mind, the spaces of the coffee houses in general. And of course, a lot of these Molly houses are this is what the action of a coffee house in the evening.
Yeah. And the coffee houses become very dangerous spaces because it's where people will bring in the newspapers and they'll sit and they will share the stories and the gossip. And as time moves on, you get this kind of aggressively satirical print media. It will be talked about there. It's a place where fairly average people can sit almost in judgment of their, in quotes, betters. And they are keyed up on coffee and hot chocolate and things like that, which is not like the modern hot chocolate. That stuff will have you climbing on the ceiling because it's mixed with all sorts of things. It seems to be semi-hallucinogenic. Everyone is just climbing the wall. So they're all keyed up on caffeine and gin and hot chocolate. And they're talking, and that talk easily turn to revolution, because why not?
Right.
And that I think it's one thing for us to be reading about this, what feels like a cultural revolution or a moment happening, but also seeing from our perspective a moment where even in the depositions we're seeing folks not quite know how to talk about this community, or trying to find the words for it in the way that we also don't exactly have the words for this community, which is to say being really generous with our language around how we talk about it with the game, and whether we see these moments as and I think this is also to tie in Richter Norton's work, which is to say very wrapped up in thinking of this as like a gay community, when there are a lot of facets of it through a modern lens that make it feel like a much a community that has a lot of different kinds of identities that are maybe being seen, but without any sort of language to maybe describe them. And I think this might be a nice time to actually push things further towards Richter Norton's work, and talk about a particular trial of before the 1720s. This is a moment that really stretches across the entire 18th century, right? And beyond that. But when it comes to early writings, and one of the first trials that I've read about was this trial of the Molly Club in 1709, right? Mm-hmm. And in this trial, there was what Richter Norton says, 9 gay men were arrested at a brandy shop, right? And this is one of the first descriptions of a Molly of like a Molly House community. One of the and I think there's something that I wanted to dive into with the idea of some of the depositions also refer to gangs and to the collections of folks, because it's not just to say that a lot of people were coming from average or very pedestrian backgrounds, but we're to say that some were absolute thieves and folks that were put into positions where this was their livelihood was wrapped up in this community as well.
Well, we should say a word about the author, right? So this is written by Ned Ward. And if we're thinking about, one reason why I think it's important to talk about coffee house culture is it is this, we call them coffee houses, right? This isn't a coffee shop. And there is this slippage between the public and private sphere in the world of the coffee house, which is, of course, part of their danger, as well as the things they might be putting in those drinks. But during this time where you have so much more of the what we might think of as a private sphere getting exposed, you have people like Ned Ward, who was I guess you could call him a freelance journalist, but he had this sort of epic work called The London Spy, which, Kat, I imagine you've spent a lot of time with, which is this amazing long kind of survey or gallivant through London, where he would just get into scrapes and then talk about them in a public forum. And this is just a section of it that has to do with the Molly houses. So the fact that something could happen in one of these little, in a shop off the way, and then it could be remembered, seen, enshrined in a published book that is going to be republished and republished throughout the 18th century. This is the stuff of history making that is what makes the modern period so exciting. Because if we're talking about Rome, we have to guess from some some message written on a wall or a letter from Cicero. But here we have an eyewitness kind of stumbling around London and presenting a journal of their travel. So this is sort of like the original Gonzo journalism.
Yeah, I find the description of the Mollies and the way they behave, and the kind of luridly misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic language. It's clearly designed to incite something between humor and revulsion. They fancy themselves women, imitating all the little vanities that custom has reconciled to the female sex, affecting to speak, walk, tattle, curtsy, cry, scold, and to mimic all manner of effeminacy that has ever fallen in their several observations. So it's this idea that they're spying on ladies and then kind of aping the worst parts of the female sex. And there's a part of me that thinks, did he get a whisper of Molly's and then just go to town? I mean, it's entirely possible that he did hear about a Molly pretending to give birth and there being this little jointed baby dolly delivered.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible. But it's also possible that that is the sort of thing that is designed to make this group and people who are like them seem so utterly other, so depraved, and such a concern to the community that they must be essentially eroded from it.
Right. Yeah. The question of the lying-ins, I think, is fascinating, because I think Joe had wanted them to be in the game. And then when I read more of Richter Norton and have been thinking about them more, I've been finding myself, to your point, Kat, thinking, to what degree is this a sensationalist embellishment? And Richter Norton, his note on it is unbelievable, because he talks about how this sort of ritual is associated with, he puts it in the context of folk rituals associated with Mardi Gras carnivals. And of course, that kind of brings us to the anti-Catholic element, the undercurrent, which I know has been right beneath the surface of this conversation, which we'll be holding into. But it is one of those things where we're like running into the kind of carnivalesque element of this, and to what degree is that being accentuated, heightened, embellished? Because you can sort of triangulate from this piece by Ward and from the depositions, you can find certain things, right? Some language potentially that might have been carried over. Certainly the notion of like the locations of where these things are happening, but then you get into these long extended descriptions that feel like they are just completely out of sight. They are something like we are being toyed with, even as modern readers. And I think there is always firsthand accounts are so precious and rare in the historical record that there's a tendency to take them at face value, as opposed to taking them as a commodity that was being generated for public consumption.
Yeah. I mean, when I read this account, it has wafts for me of like satanic panic. That it's this kind of horrendous inversion, that there's some terrifying cult of men who dress up as women and pretend to be married to each other, and my goodness, they're inverting everything. And isn't it just so helpful that this journalist knows so much? And I'm reminded of another book that's published for profit, which is the book on cant, the language of the streets. And it's a book that's sold to posh people, and they're told, you need to learn this because pickpockets are speaking in code. And so you need the code to avoid being pickpocketed. My question is, the bloke who's jotting down all the cant isn't one of them. So why are they telling him the code and what it means? Doesn't make a lot of sense. And similarly, this sort of, it's just so far out of pocket in terms of, if it simply said there are coffee houses or rum shops or whatever else, and in the back rooms men sit together, some of them favour women's clothing, they are affectionate with one another, they have loving relationships, and they call each other husband. It's so much less sensational than these kinds of weird fake births and baptisms that profane nature and all of the rest of it. And it might be something that happens.
Right.
It might have happened once.
Yeah, there is a an exercise that people do in like biblical apologetics, where they're always looking for, what are the elements of the story that don't conform to anything? Those are the ones that are probably right, are probably true, are probably the oldest versions of the text. And so the problem with the lying in ceremonies is they do sort of tap into the language of the carnivalesque and, popish behaviors. And so we start looking at them and thinking, okay, well, for this part of the story, he's sliding very cleanly into, a kind of anti-popish, class, And then in other instances, though, when he talks about people referring to themselves as sort of wives and husbands, well, that mimics other parts of the deposition, but doesn't seem to be like playing into any pre-structured trope. And so it might actually be like a real part of the story. This whole center section of this of the Molly's Club, where we go through, the first was doing this, the second was doing this, the third was doing that. I mean, that's like a Hogarthian tableau. Like that is being sketched and composed with the same eye for like a heightened reality as an engraving. And so it isn't to say that it's totally wrong, but it's to say that we have to treat the record with a little bit of skepticism.
Yeah. And like Hogarth, it's aimed at serving a moralizing purpose, but also bringing profit to the author.
Yes, yeah, precisely. I mean, these are pieces bought and sold,
Yeah.
I do think, one note I'll mention before we get to the poem, depending on what I might want to say about the verse, is this last paragraph. Thus, without detection, they continued their odious society for some years, till the practices were happily discovered by the cunning management of the underagents of the reforming society. Now, this is an interesting gesture, because to me, I read that line and I thought, oh, Ned Ward, you are worried about the Society for the Reformation of Manners. So you, of course, are going to, kind of like offer them a bow or a little bit of gesture, just to make sure that people were quite clear where his sympathies lied. And it points to the threat of even encountering these spaces, right? So this is, if he has this large kind of expose, he would not want anyone to think that he had any part of it. And how can you communicate that effectively? Well, you can gesture, or you can make a gesture of respect to the, to the chief agitators and all of this. And that that is a place where, like, I don't know how much of his understanding of Molly's is real, but I can sense that his worry about the Society for the Reformation of Manners might be coming from a real place.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, we talk about cancel culture a lot, but if they get you in their crosshairs, I mean, that's it. I think in the historical past, shall we say, in a time where bank accounts are for countries rather than individuals, your personal credit within your community is massively important. And personal credit is not simply about your capacity to pay back debts. It is about how your health is perceived, both physical and moral, how you manage your household. And so having knowledge that the Society for Reformation of Manners are on your case in some way, shape, or form, even if they don't know the context, is going to give people reason not to help you, do business with you, lend you money, sit beside you in church, all of those things that make up a community. And certainly London is a much more fragmented and bitty, vagrant community. But there are still an expectation of having, for example, a home parish church. And all of those things anchor people to spaces in ways that I think it certainly is unfamiliar to modern London.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because we are looking. I mean, it is amazing how small the past is. This is something that I found when I was in school. You were always running into the fact that everyone seemed to know everyone. And I was reading Zadie Smith's reflection on having completed this great historical novel, and she talked about her desire to not put Charles Dickens in it, but Dickens kept showing up at parties in the historical record. He kept running into the people who were the chief actors in her story, and she thought, okay, fine, I'll have to put him in it. And there's this way that the past, especially, is just so small, and I think we are talking, when we talk about the Molly houses of High Holborn, we are talking about a pretty small community. We are talking about a small college worth of people who definitely knew each other, and nothing that happened in that community would have been a surprise, right? And so that then kind of brings us a little bit to thinking about, well, why then at this moment did things seem to change, right? And I think that there are like a number of countervailing forces that kind of lead us to this moment of incredible persecution that then lasts 20 years or so. And it's worth sort of thinking about it. And there's a lovely clue in the verse, and I was very thankful to the Richard Norton's website for noting that these mollies be damned as deep as Dr. Oates, and referencing, of course, Titus Oates, which as is just a lovely index of kind of the broader context which this is happening. So I wonder, Kat, I mean, would you want to talk a little bit about, you've talked about the Hanoverians, and this might be as good as time as any to think about 1688 and like the broader context for the society and their actions.
Yes, so we're gonna shoot back all the way to Glorious Revolution, are we?
Yeah, I mean, just for a moment.
Okay, so in broad strokes, let's just do a kind of a rundown of the history. I think many people, there are two gateway drugs into history, and it's either Victorians or it's the Tudors. So I'm going to come at it from the Tudors.
Yes, okay, good. So, and this event's a problem because it's right in the middle.
Yeah, so this is I start with the Tudors, and let's just hop right to the end. Elizabeth I dies. She's not married. She's not got an heir of her body. So her cousin-ish comes down from Scotland. He's James VI of Scots, first of England. He sits on the throne. What happens then is it's his son comes after him, Charles I. We behead him. We then have a period called the Interregnum, where Oliver Cromwell, who is a Puritan, he's allied with the Puritans, is not on the throne because he's definitely not a king, despite the fact that he had something very similar to a coronation ceremony, and he did enjoy sleeping in palaces whenever he could. And also, he wanted his son to be the protector after him, Richard. That doesn't work out. He's known as Tumbledown Dick. We invite Charles I's son back, and surprisingly, he agrees. So Charles II comes back. He has lots of children, none by his wife. So then it becomes his brother. It's his turn to be king, James II. Now, James II, during his brother's reign, for some reason, best known to himself, has publicly reverted or converted to the Roman Catholic faith. This was, broadly speaking, fine because he had two older daughters who had been raised Protestant. Lovely. But then he marries a Roman Catholic and they have a son. And this is a problem. The Lords aren't very keen on a return to Rome. They don't want a Roman succession. And so they invite James II's eldest daughter and her cousin husband to come over and invade. This is the Glorious Revolution. It's called that because it's, in quotes, a bloodless revolution in England. Lots of bloodshed elsewhere, of course. And William and Mary then essentially set about what becomes a constitutional monarchy. The position of monarch or co-rulers as both head of state and head of the church in England. But of course, in part, all of this has been possible because we've had this little segment of a Puritan republic, a Puritan commonwealth. And the faith practices are all over the map. We have a monarchy that's trying to hold things together. William and Mary don't have children. So they're Mary's sister Anne. She also doesn't have a surviving heir. In order to deal with the fact that they have now made it illegal for a Roman Catholic to sit on the throne, they have to go back up the family tree to James, to his daughter, and down to the House of Hanover. And the House of Hanover is the Protestant line that starts in this country. We have George I come over. And so this monarch is here because of his religion, but also he is here because the Parliament and the people permit him to be, and they wish him to be. And that is the choice. He is proclaimed, acclaimed, and anointed. And so within this background of threats and revolutions and uprising, faith and morality are, I suppose, the linchpin along all of it. And when you couple this, my belief is that one of the reasons why we have these periods of moral panic and a desire to expunge parts of our society and our community that we deem to be dangerous, I think it ties into the understanding of the human body as a humoral makeup. When your medicine is founded upon the fact that if you have too much of something, you will be sick, so you must purge it. You must use an emetic or bleeding or whatever else. For me, when you think about the nation of England and then latterly after the Union, the Union of Great Britain, you have a body politic there. And the participles and the parts within that body politic, the populace, can be value adding or value detracting. And when they misbehave, they can make the entire body sick. And a sick realm, a morally sick realm, of course, gets brought down upon it divine judgment in the thinking of the time. So that's where I go from 1688.
Sure.
A little ramble.
Well, no, it's very helpful, and I think the reason why I was delighted to have you offer that sort of history dancing on top of a pin, because I think that there's always the tendency when doing historical work and talking about the past for people to read the present into the past. it's good because that it points at the relevance and the long half-lives of many of these ideas. On the other hand, it can sometimes erase the particular contingencies of that moment. And so the reason why I bring this up is the society. So in our own time, if we think about satanic panics, I'll use the example of the United States. It's very closely linked to the rise of the evangelical political movement. It has a lot to do with, the rise of the new right and the John Birch Society, all that stuff. And then that sort of starts creating the grounds on which, queer people of all stripes are persecuted in the United States. Now, that is similar in some ways to the context of persecution in the late 19th century, but it's different in some other ways. And, going all the way back to the late 17th century here, this is a different kind of political context because the uncertainty of the uncertainty around the arrival of the Hanoverians essentially creates a moral panic. And so, and I thought that Andrew Gordon Craig's dissertation actually outlined this very beautifully, and talked about how, if you want to really understand this subject, you should be looking at, you need to have to actually understand how the Society for the Restoration of Manners, it didn't jump into being because there were a bunch of pastors who thought people were being immoral. It came out of a political need and what we might think of as a kind of purity politics that was worried about the Roman Catholic Church, and it was worried about it was worried about the quality of the citizen at a time in which the citizen was a kind of newly reemerging category of human. So we have to pay a lot of attention, in a world that could be and this is maybe stating it too baldly, in a society that might be a republic, you have to pay more attention to the individual than you might otherwise. And questions of personal purity start mattering.
For sure. And I think also on top of that, identity, we get these kinds of conversations about battles for the soul of the nation. And when you have, in this time, you've still got a Jacobite threat. That may be a term that people are familiar with, but just in case they aren't, I will quickly pass that. So the Jacobites believe that the descendants, the direct male line from James II, are the rightful monarchs. So they should be there over William and Mary, over Anne, and certainly over the Georges. And there are uprisings in Scotland in service of this Jacobite cause. They are Roman Catholic, but they're also the recognizably Stuart line. They come from these islands. When you have got a monarchy that in some ways has lost its divine right, it's now a constitutional monarchy. We know that they are here because we don't want to be Roman Catholic, but it's the price of being Roman Catholic that our head of state is a Hanoverian. George I doesn't speak great English, speaks it with a very, very heavy accent, if at all. His son is the same. And when your monarch doesn't look like you, then it becomes a question of who are we? What do we stand for? And so I think, as you rightly say, people start casting around for individuals to point to as this is what we are and this is what we are not. And those that we are not the most need to be dispatched quickly.
It makes me think of how much the act of the community building of the Mollies is such an affront to that then. Right? Which is like to say its own act of resistance or its own sort of like performance as showing that there is something to push back against in whatever way, whether that's a sharing of an identity or a lying in or whatever it might be. Which I especially see in the acts of of calling of a member of the Mali might calling someone else a queen or acting effeminately or sitting in their lap, right?
Well, and I always think about a coffee house is not a parish, right? And so if you start affiliating with the, I mean, I'll call them barflies, right? To even take it out of the context of the Molly house, but if you start affiliating with a different type of community, um, suddenly you are operating in a space outside of a traditional community format, right? And then that means that there aren't the kind of quote the usual protections for keeping people in line. And
Mm.
then and in this light, Molly House has become one expression of this kind of freely rearranging and burgeoning society where you have all these different kinds of found communities. I mean, just the idea that a community can be found, right? The Molly houses are a symptom of that. They're not, the core element. And it's interesting that the society, in trying to build its case, how they, I mean, it's interesting I guess let me restate that. The society, for the Revelation of Manners, sees a problem and they're going to go about a specific prescription. And I think that they find traction in creating panic around the idea of gender nonconformity that maybe has more traction than even issues around prostitution. And this is a place where I will now commit the sin that I previously talked about, which is it for issues relating around trans people in the United States. This story is going to sound all too familiar because in some ways it's a very small issue. This is a small segment of the population, but an inordinate amount of focus is being spent on it because the people who are using it as a dividing issue are finding it to be provocative in the worst kinds of ways. And I think to then get into drill into a specific example, I thought in this dissertation, watching the attempts at persecution, and I'll now bring us into Captain Edward Rigby, the commander of the warship HMS Dragoon, who gets caught, maybe let's say red-handed for sodomy in 1698, but it is and is guilty and is put up for pillory for 3 days, but nothing happens to him. And the society attempts to dragoon that into some kind of success story, when in point of fact, at least at that time, whatever this person did, it wasn't enough for someone standing by to throw a tomato at him. Which is to say that the outrage, the hatred, had to be designed and conditioned over decades, because it certainly doesn't seem like it was there in 1698.
Yeah, absolutely. That's yes, very much so. And I think we talking about as well the language of and kind of playing on that language. They call each other queen and they curtsy and all of that. Without wishing to date myself too much, I grew up in a United Kingdom where Section 28 was in force. So Maggie Milkfief was telling everybody that people did not have an inalienable right to be gay, and that it shouldn't be talked about in schools. And so schools were not allowed to mention gay couples as a parameter in which you could experience a relationship. I, on the other hand, was growing up in a family where my aunt worked with an HIV and AIDS charity. We were living in a very artistic part of London, so my mother had lots and lots of older gay friends. And so when I hear about the Mollies calling each other queen and darling, I'm reminded of my mum's friends being like, "Oh, get her!" Like it's not that. It's a sardonic, high camp, ironic usage that was still very much in force in the latter part of the 20th century, and no doubt into the 21st century. That is a linguistic quirk that exists. And so I don't, when I read that, I'm like, well, yeah, that's still happening, but it doesn't necessarily mean what they are inferring that it means.
there's this. I mean, I think this is what not to become just a a billboard for the study of history broadly. I mean, I think one of the things that so compels me about the modern period, especially the early modern period, is this is a place where the society that we exist in really does become recognizable. I mean, I think, to Foucault's us being other Victorians, we're other Georgians in other ways. And there's just this tremendous half-life to these ideas where you find little linguistic quirks that start emerging at this time and that still get to stick with us, right?
Mm.
And I mean, I think Section 28 is a great example because, if I think a student in 500 years is going to look at Section 28 and assume it was written 200 years before it was written. It'll all kind of blend. It'll all sort of blend together as an
Yeah.
artifact of an earlier period.
Yeah.
To bring it back to this final reading, I wanted to make a note that across all of these different readings are also this are providing a really like large foundation for the sense of place in the game. It's why in every iteration that we've had with Joe, there's always been a place for Pillory. There's always been cruising grounds. There's always been these very specific locations, and in our scope of games, we've there's been like large modes where we haven't had such distinct maps before, and we're really like focusing down on very close, not just locales but also individuals, which is to say operating in larger systems at play. But I wanted to bring it back for the latter story of Captain Rigby. Wanted to make sure. Just to like put the to make sure that that story ended, with Pillory, and all of these a lot of these stories, though as cosmopolitan as they might be, are often placed within their the pamphletized, the propagandized backdrop of how they're being shared for the next while, which is to say also making sure that is transparent in the game, right? And I know Cole and I have gone back and forth with like how to make sure players are feeling some of the pressures of what it is to be caught and arrested in the game, but to make sure that it also feels very relevant to what what sort of pressures we're reading about in some of these secondary sources like this.
Right. I mean, there's no disguising the fact that even for the folks who might be called Mollies in the 17 teens and early 20s, they were doing something that had a threat to it. And if you search in the Court of the Old Bailey under keywords for things like sodomy, you will find more than just the 4 that we looked at, and stretching over a long period of time. And so I think it's a tricky balance within the context of a game, because I think you want the threat, you want the real mortal threat present in the design, but it has to be sufficiently muted to encourage players to take the risks that the people took at the time. I mean, and this is perhaps getting a little into philosophies of game design, but we found that we had to find ways for not to trick the players, but to get the players to make calculations that they might lose, because they needed to feel both. I mean, you want players on one hand to feel safe from their actions so that they behave historically, but then also to feel the consequences of those actions. And so we've had to negotiate it kind of both ways. And really, the other thing I'll mention, Drew, and this is a slightly broader point, is, and this takes us way back to the comment right at the start about designs as historical fiction. So, we are using Mother Claps as our home base Molly House in the game Molly House. It wasn't the only one. And in some ways within the design, it's slightly anonymous. We don't want we're not trying to tell necessarily just the story of Mother's Claps. We're trying to tell the story of a Molly House, if I were to give it a very Victorian subtitle. And that is meant to allow players to project themselves onto the past, to immerse themselves, to feel some of the pressures at work. And for us to use a little bit of historic specificity at specific moments. One thing that we haven't talked about too much is the role of the informer. And Kat, this is something that Drew and I we talked about in earlier design chats quite a bit. There were versions of this design that did not have informers in them, where the Molly houses would close on a schedule determined by the design of the game and not by the players. And what we found over and over again was that the informers were simply too important part of this of the story to be automated. The Molly houses were brought down within as well as without, and that had to be some part of the story, especially because the fact that we know anything about them at all is because of people who we might class as informants, or whatever Ward described them to, those agents, the clever agents, and that can be a pretty sobering part of this story, and so it's taken a long time to figure out what the right balance of coercion and fear that would encourage players to sort of take that turn. But I think our hope in assembling all of these documents is to provide players with a kind of grounding, a kind of historic specificity that they won't necessarily find in the game itself. So, for example, Molly House is played with a deck of cards. The deck of cards represent desires. And the cards are built as a French style poker deck. So we have suits and symbols, but they have a little bit of flavor text. And that flavor text is really just a snatch of words. And their words often pulled directly from the depositions. And they're meant as little indexes, little like glimmers, little pieces of sea glass that are remnants of this much larger record. And we thought this is a more effective way of communicating a kind of shattered history than having a big blocky paragraph describing everything we know about Gabriel Lawrence or something like that. And so, but it's a little bit more of an elliptical style of storytelling. And I hope that for folks today, kind of looking through all these records, they got a sense of why we've sort of arranged things like this. And of course, there is still a lot to be gained from that more careful arrangement. And again, I point to that lovely dissertation as the benefit of trying to arrange all those pieces into a larger mosaic.
It's that tricky work of doing the interpretive work, right? Of how best to represent this moment. And we've explored the flavor text paragraphs already. So this is to say we're not just exploring and experimenting with new platforms and new design and new everything else, but also with like new approaches to how best to tailor this history to this project, right? And all the way down to how players are interpreting and having that history resound with them further. Because there is definitely some poetry in this, whether it's coming from Ned Ward's rhyming or not. But there is certainly some poetry at play within the sorts of like scenes and vignettes that come out in this history. Okay, well, I'm going to use this moment again as we muse to say thank you for the questions as we've been writing. And I don't want to overstay any welcome. I would be happy to stay here as long as possible. But I appreciate the folks that have written in the comments, and feel free when this recording is posted to be sharing your comments as well, because this is a conversation that we get to continue having, and especially as we bring crowdfunding to this project to a close at the end of this week, which is wild to say and really exciting. That the work of really sharing this moment in history is we're just now bringing it to to a head. All of the hard work remains, and then we really get to share the final product next year. So we won't get tired of any of these stories for a long time to come. Okay. So at this, I'm going to bring us all back. Sorry, I got distracted. Because I'm looking at all of the wonderful folks that were watching live. I wanted to say a big thank you to Dr. Cat, to Cole for spending your time with us tonight and chatting, and for folks that are not following you yet, where can people find you?
So if you go to YouTube, you can find me at Reading the Past. I'm also on TikTok as Katrina Marchant, and Instagram, and occasionally on Twitter. Sorry, X. But yes, those places, mostly on YouTube.
Fantastic. Well, I know that your video on the Molly houses and several others have absolutely delighted me, and they've been really it's been really fun to elevate and raise the work that you've done. I'm excited to continue watching the new videos as they come out too.
Thank you.
And Cole, loved seeing the new ARCs board as ever, and all the new ARC stuff today.
It is. I had such a nice time talking to you, Kat. Thanks for coming along. It is so nice to chat about this period with your wealth of experience and knowledge, and I'm just very thankful for it. And I know, Drew, that we get to the next project. I love giving folks the primary reading early and getting us all talking about the history as we go about the work of making the game, because they are, of course, so related. So just, Drew and I are getting ready next week to reignite our final development on the game, which we always pause it during a crowdfunding campaign because you can only juggle so many balls at once. But next week we'll be getting back into the development, and Drew, I have to say this conversation has completely fired me up. I've got 1,000 ideas swirling around, and I'm just very thankful, both Drew for you for hosting it, and Kat for all of your wonderful comments.
Well, I want to thank both of you, and also Joe, for the amount of work that you have put into this game. And I think it's so important as a way in for this hidden history. It's going to be so useful at getting people to know about the Mollies. And the thing for me is that when you look at the accounts, even people who are trying to bring them down, when they talk about the world of the Mollies, they're trying to make them sound as bad as possible. But to me, they are the people that I want to hang out with, even in the court records, because there is definitely going to be an enormous amount of risk. But the great thing about the Mollies is they're so fun that spending time with them in the world of the game is going to be such a privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. And I cannot agree more.
Okay, well, at that, I can't promise wigs at any of our future conventions, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks all for watching, and we'll take care. Thanks again, Kat.